June 18, 1943, Cologne, Germany. The evening air hung heavy with the scent of summer blossoms as Robert Miller straightened his tie in the mirror of his modest apartment. In 3 hours, he would attend a social gathering at the home of Colonel Friedrich Hoffmann, where he would be introduced to the colonel's daughter, Elise, a woman he was tasked with charming, courting, and eventually marrying as part of his deep cover operation. Little did he know that what began as a calculated mission would transform into something that would challenge every oath he had ever taken. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the extraordinary account of how a man sent to deceive found himself caught between duty and desire, and how the line between performance and reality blurred until neither side could recognize the truth. A story of how love emerged in the most unexpected place during humanity's darkest hour. Robert Miller was not Robert Miller at all. His real name was James Donovan, a 32-year-old mathematics professor from Boston who had been recruited by the Office of Strategic Services in 1941. After 18 months of intensive training, including 360 hours of German language instruction, 120 hours of cultural immersion, and 8 weeks of communications training, he had been inserted into German society with a meticulously crafted cover identity. According to his papers, he was Robert Miller, a Swiss mathematics professor with distant German ancestry who had moved to Cologne to work as a civilian consultant for transportation logistics. Remember, your primary objective is to gather intelligence on railway movements through Cologne, his handler, William Carrington, had told him during their final briefing in London. Colonel Hoffmann oversees much of the Western transportation network. His home, his office, his connections, they're all valuable to us and his daughter. I understand, sir, James had replied, though the words tasted bitter in his mouth. Carrington had smiled without warmth. The colonel's wife passed away 2 years ago. His daughter is his world now. Get close to her, and you get close to everything we need. What the OSS had learned was that Colonel Friedrich Hoffmann, a 59-year-old widower, had risen through the ranks not through ideological fervor, but through his extraordinary organizational abilities. He had 346 trains under his direct supervision, moving everything from civilian supplies to military equipment across an area spanning 187,000 square kilometers. More importantly, he frequently hosted gatherings where high-ranking officials discussed matters with surprising candor, believing they were among trusted friends. His daughter, Elise Hoffmann, 27, worked as a nurse at Cologne's main hospital. According to intelligence, she was intelligent, well-educated, and, crucially, seemed ambivalent about politics. In the eyes of Donovan's superiors, this made her the perfect target. That evening at the Hoffmann residence, a stately 3-story home in one of Cologne's more affluent neighborhoods, James found himself mingling with 24 guests, a mixture of military officers, local officials, and their spouses. The interior of the home reflected tasteful elegance rather than ostentatious wealth. Polished hardwood floors, classical artwork, and furnishings that spoke of comfort rather than extravagance. Herr Miller, Colonel Hoffmann's voice pulled James from his observations. I would like to introduce you to my daughter, Elise. James turned to find himself face to face with a woman of striking presence. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, too defined. But there was an intelligence in her grey eyes that immediately commanded attention. My father tells me you are a mathematician, Herr Miller, she said, her German crisp and formal. James nodded, slipping easily into his role. Indeed. Though I fear my work with transportation efficiency matrices sounds terribly dull at a social gathering. On the contrary, she replied. In times like these, efficiency is not merely mathematics. It is the difference between scarcity and sufficiency. James noted the careful neutrality of her statement, a comment that could be interpreted as patriotic or merely practical. This was his opening, and he took it. Fräulein Hoffmann, would you mind terribly showing me your father's library? I've heard it contains some impressive volumes on Germanic history. It was a calculated request. According to his briefing, the colonel's library overlooked his study, where he often retreated with select guests during these gatherings. Elise regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Herr Miller, though I must warn you, my father's collection reflects his obsession with medieval history more than anything else." As they walked through the house, James mentally recorded everything he saw, the layout of the rooms, the locations of telephones, the faces of the Colonel's guests. But when they reached the library, a modest room lined with leather-bound volumes, he found his attention genuinely captured by the collection. "These are quite remarkable," he said, running his fingers along the spine of a 19th-century history of the Holy Roman Empire. "Your father has excellent taste." "He believes one cannot understand the present without studying the past," Elise replied, watching him closely. "And what do you believe, Herr Miller?" It was a test, subtle but unmistakable. James selected his words carefully. "I believe that numbers do not lie, Fräulein Hoffmann, but I also believe that behind every equation is a human element that cannot be quantified." She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "You speak like a philosopher, not a mathematician. Perhaps in Switzerland we are permitted to be both." That first meeting lasted 47 minutes. James learned that Elise had studied literature at the University of Berlin before the war, that she played the piano, and that she had volunteered as a nurse despite her father's initial objections. What she learned about him was a careful mixture of truth and fiction, his genuine passion for mathematics woven seamlessly with his fabricated Swiss upbringing. Over the following weeks, James arranged several seemingly chance encounters with Elise, at the market near her home, at a concert of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and finally at the hospital where she worked. Each meeting was meticulously documented in encrypted messages sent to London through a complex network of cutouts and radio operators. "Subject appears receptive to further contact," he wrote in his third report. "Have established common interest in classical music and literature. Proceeding to Phase 2. Phase 2 was a formal courtship. With the Colonel's permission, sought through proper channels to maintain appearances, James began escorting Elise to various social functions: a dinner at the home of a university colleague, an afternoon concert in the city park, a walking tour of Cologne's historical cathedral. During this time, James also began cultivating his relationship with Colonel Hoffmann, engaging him in discussions about logistics, history, and the challenges of civilian transportation during wartime. The Colonel, initially reserved, gradually warmed to the Swiss professor, who showed such interest in both his professional expertise and his daughter. "You must understand," the Colonel told him one evening as they shared brandy in his study, "maintaining 6 passenger routes and 12 freight lines with reduced personnel is like solving a puzzle where the pieces change shape daily." "Fascinating," James replied, noting the maps on the wall behind the Colonel's desk. "How many cars are typically in a transport convoy?" "It varies. For standard passenger service, perhaps 6 to 8. For priority freight, we might attach 12 to 15. The real challenge is coordinating the schedules when an unexpected delay occurs." Each such conversation yielded valuable intelligence that James carefully memorized and later transmitted: the frequency of military transports, the locations of fuel depots, the schedules of trains carrying supplies to the Eastern Front. But as weeks turned into months, something unexpected began to happen. James found himself looking forward to his meetings with Elise, not merely as operational necessities, but as moments of genuine connection. By October 1943, 4 months into the operation, James realized he was in dangerous territory. The line between his cover identity and his true self had begun to blur. He genuinely enjoyed the evenings spent at the Hoffmann home, the conversations with the Colonel about historical European borders and ancient trade routes, and most disturbing of all, the hours spent with Elise. "You seem troubled today," Elise observed as they walked along the Rhine one crisp autumn afternoon. The river flowed before them, sunlight dancing across its surface as barges moved steadily north. "Just thinking about home," James replied, allowing a genuine emotion to surface. "It has been a long time." "Do you miss Switzerland very much?" The question pierced him. "I miss certain things, certain people." Elise took his arm, a gesture of intimacy that had become natural between them. "Tell me about your family." And here, James made a critical decision. He spoke of his real mother, her passion for teaching and her collection of first-edition novels. He described his actual childhood home in Massachusetts, though he transplanted it to the shores of Lake Geneva. He shared true memories of his father teaching him to play chess, though he changed the man from a Boston attorney to a Swiss watchmaker. "You speak of them with such love," Elise said softly. "They are easy to love," James replied, and in that moment, looking at Elise's face illuminated by the setting sun, he realized with a cold clarity that he was falling in love with her. That evening, in the privacy of his apartment, James drafted his report with shaking hands. Relationship progressing according to schedule. Subject increasingly trusting. Have gained regular access to target residence and established rapport with primary target, requesting authorization to proceed to Phase 3. Phase 3 was the proposal of marriage. His handler's response came 2 days later, hidden in a classified advertisement in the local newspaper. Authorization granted, proceed with caution. In December 1943, as Christmas decorations appeared throughout Cologne, James found himself standing in Colonel Hoffman's study, formally requesting permission to marry Elise. The moment was surreal, a genuine request wrapped in layers of deception. "You must understand, Herr Miller," the colonel said, studying him intently. "Elise is everything to me since her mother passed. She has many suitors, yet she speaks of you differently." "I love her, sir," James said, and was startled to realize he was speaking the truth. The colonel nodded slowly. "I believe you do, and these days, one must seize happiness where one can find it." He extended his hand. "You have my blessing." That night, at a small restaurant overlooking the cathedral, James proposed to Elise with a modest diamond ring, provided by his handlers and delivered through a complex series of dead drops. As he slipped it onto her finger, he felt a conflict within himself, unlike anything he had experienced before. "I never expected to find someone like you," Elise said, tears in her eyes. "Especially not now, not in these times." "Nor I you," James replied, the truth of his words burning in his chest. The wedding was set for February 14th, 1944, a date selected by his handlers for its symbolic value to Americans and its seeming romanticism to the Germans. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, James continued his intelligence gathering, with increased access to the colonel's home and social circle. He learned of a planned reinforcement of troops to the Atlantic Wall, of fuel shortages affecting the eastern supply lines, of growing tensions between military commanders and political appointees. Yet with each report he filed, each piece of intelligence he passed along, the weight of his deception grew heavier. 2 weeks before the wedding, Elise invited James to accompany her to visit wounded soldiers at the hospital where she worked. The experience was harrowing. Dozens of young men with injuries from the Eastern Front, many of them no older than 20. James watched as Elise moved among them with gentle efficiency, changing bandages, offering words of comfort, treating each man with the same care regardless of rank. "You are quite remarkable," he told her afterward as they walked home through the winter streets. "They are just boys," she said quietly. "Most of them did not ask for any of this." "And you? What do you want, Elise?" She stopped walking and turned to face him. "I want what everyone wants, Robert. A life not defined by this conflict, a home, children, peace." She touched his face gently. "I want a future with you." That night, alone in his apartment, James faced the most difficult decision of his life. His mission was proceeding perfectly. He had gained the complete trust of both Elise and her father. After the wedding, he would have even greater access to intelligence that could save countless Allied lives. And yet, the thought of building that access on the foundation of Elise's love he had deliberately cultivated, but now genuinely returned, filled him with self-loathing. For the first time since his deployment, James considered abandoning his mission. The fantasy played out in his mind, confessing everything to Elise, escaping with her to Switzerland, leaving the war behind. But the reality was stark. Such an action would be viewed as treason by his countrymen and as the ultimate betrayal by Elise. Moreover, it would sacrifice the intelligence network he had helped to build, intelligence that was undoubtedly saving lives. The wedding day arrived cold but clear. The ceremony was held in Cologne's oldest church, a modest affair with 60 guests, mostly colleagues of the colonel and fellow nurses who worked with Elise. James stood at the altar, watching as Elise walked toward him in a simple white dress, her father beside her. In that moment, despite everything, he felt a surge of genuine joy. The reception was held at the Hoffman home, transformed for the occasion with flowers and music. James moved through the celebration in a state of emotional turmoil, playing his role perfectly, while grappling with his divided loyalties. It was during this reception that Colonel Hoffman drew him aside into his study. "I have a wedding gift for you," the colonel said, closing the door behind them. From his desk he withdrew a large envelope. "I have arranged a position for you in my department. Civilian consultant, official papers, everything properly authorized." James accepted the envelope with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing. It is selfish of me, really. I keep my daughter close and I gain a brilliant mathematician to help organize our increasingly complex scheduling problems." The colonel poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to James. "To family." The irony was unbearable. With this position, James would have direct access to the very information his handlers had sent him to obtain. His mission was succeeding beyond all expectations. And yet, as he raised his glass in toast, he had never felt more like a failure as a human being. That night, in the small apartment that would now be their shared home, Elise having insisted they maintain their own space rather than live with her father, James held his new wife in his arms and made a silent vow. He would continue his mission, would continue to gather and transmit the intelligence that might help end this war sooner, but he would protect Elise, would shield her as much as possible from whatever came afterward. In the months that followed, James settled into his dual life with increasing discomfort. By day, he worked in Colonel Hoffman's department, using his mathematical skills to help optimize railway schedules while secretly documenting troop movements, supply shipments, and military deployments. By night, he built a life with Elise, cooking meals together, reading aloud from her favorite books, planning for a future he knew might never exist. His transmissions to London became increasingly valuable as the Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe. Through his position, he was able to provide detailed information on German defensive preparations, railway vulnerabilities, and the movement of reinforcements. His handlers' responses were filled with praise, intelligence proving extremely valuable, continue excellent work. Yet with each passing week, James found the compartmentalization more difficult to maintain. He genuinely cared for his father-in-law, a man who had welcomed him into his home and family. He deeply loved his wife, whose kindness and intelligence had proven to be no act of deception but her true character. And with that love came fear, fear of discovery, fear of what would happen to them when the truth inevitably came to light. In April 1944, 2 months after their wedding, Elise shared news that shattered what remained of James's emotional defenses. She was expecting their child. The joy in her eyes as she told him left him speechless, capable only of embracing her while his mind raced with implications he could barely process. That night, after Elise had fallen asleep, James sat at their small kitchen table and drafted a message unlike any he had sent before. In it, he formally requested extraction, not for himself but for Elise and her father when the time came. It was a request without precedent, asking his superiors to extend protection to the family of a high-ranking German officer, based solely on the word of their agent that neither had committed any crimes against humanity. The response, when it came a week later, was non-committal. Request noted, continue mission, further instructions forthcoming. As spring turned to summer, the situation in Germany grew increasingly tense. News of the Allied landing in Normandy in June sent shockwaves through Cologne. James watched as his father-in-law struggled to maintain the railway systems amid growing chaos, fuel shortages, equipment failures, and increasingly desperate orders from above. "They demand impossibilities," the colonel confided one evening, the strain evident in his voice. "Yesterday I received orders to double the capacity of the Western Line. With what locomotives? With what coal? With what personnel?" He shook his head wearily. Logic has abandoned those in command. James nodded sympathetically while committing the information to memory. That same night he transmitted details of the railway system's breaking points. Knowing this information would help Allied planners target their bombing campaigns for maximum disruption with minimum civilian casualties. The moral complexity of his position had become nearly unbearable. Each piece of intelligence he passed along helped hasten the end of the conflict, a goal he believed in completely. Yet each piece also hastened the downfall of the society in which his wife, his unborn child, and his father-in-law lived. He was both hastening their liberation and endangering their immediate safety. In July 1944, with Elise 5 months pregnant, the first major bombing raid struck Cologne's railway yards. Though James had provided information that helped planners avoid residential areas, the sound of distant explosions still filled him with dread. He held Elise close in the shelter beneath their building, feeling her trembling against him. "It will be all right," he whispered, the lie bitter on his tongue. "We will be all right." The following day, surveying the damage with Colonel Hoffman, James witnessed the devastation firsthand. 3 main junctions destroyed, 5 locomotives damaged beyond repair. Hundreds of meters of track reduced to twisted metal, what he had helped to create. "It will take weeks to restore even limited service," the colonel said, his voice hollow. "And for what purpose? To delay the inevitable." James looked at him sharply. "What do you mean, sir?" The colonel glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I am not a fool, Robert, nor am I a fanatic. The way forward is clear to anyone with eyes to see and the courage to acknowledge it. This conflict is lost, has been for some time." It was the closest the colonel had ever come to expressing defeatism, a crime punishable by death under the current regime. That he would share such thoughts with James indicated a level of trust that made James's ongoing deception all the more painful. "What will you do?" James asked carefully. "My duty," the colonel replied simply, "until I cannot. I have spent my life in service to my country, not to ideologies or to madmen. I will continue to do what I can to ensure that essential supplies reach the civilian population. Beyond that," he shrugged, a gesture of resignation. That evening, James transmitted this conversation verbatim, adding his personal assessment. "Subject appears to be separating loyalty to country from loyalty to regime. Potential for cooperation in post-conflict scenario should be considered." As summer gave way to autumn, the situation in Cologne deteriorated rapidly. Food became scarce, fuel even more so. The railway system operated at less than 40% capacity amid constant disruptions from Allied bombing. Through it all, James continued his work, both his official duties helping to maintain what civilian transport remained functional, and his clandestine reporting on military movements and strategic decisions. Elise, now in her 3rd trimester, continued her nursing work despite James's concerns. "My patients need me," she said simply when he suggested she reduce her hours, "and working helps me not to worry constantly." What she didn't say, but what James understood, was that her work also allowed her to feel useful in a world spinning increasingly out of control. He admired her strength, even as he feared for her safety. In October 1944, with Allied forces advancing steadily from the west, James received encrypted instructions that chilled him to the bone. Anticipate liberation of target area within 60 to 90 days. Prepare for Phase 4. Phase 4 was the final stage of his mission, the revelation of his true identity to his handlers once Allied forces took control of the area. There was no protocol for what would happen to Elise or her father, no guidance for how he should navigate the chaos that would inevitably engulf them all. That same week, Elise gave birth to their daughter, a healthy baby girl with James's dark hair and Elise's grey eyes. They named her Clara after Elise's mother. Holding his daughter for the first time, James experienced a love so fierce and protective it frightened him. Whatever came next, whatever price he had to pay for his deception, he would ensure that Clara and Elise remained safe. The winter of 1944 was the harshest in living memory, or perhaps it only seemed that way amid the growing privations. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Coal for heating became nearly unobtainable. Food supplies dwindled to the point where even the relatively privileged struggled to maintain adequate nutrition. The sound of distant artillery grew steadily closer. Through his position, James was able to secure extra rations for Elise and Clara, small advantages that eased their immediate hardship but did nothing to alleviate his growing dread. Each day brought the front lines closer. Each day brought the moment of truth nearer. In January 1945, with American forces less than 100 kilometers away, Colonel Hoffman summoned James to his office. The once meticulously organized space now reflected the general disorder. Papers piled haphazardly, maps marked with desperate annotations, an empty bottle of brandy on the corner of the desk. "You must take Elise and Clara and leave Cologne," the colonel said without preamble. "I have arranged papers, a vehicle with enough fuel to reach Switzerland, and letters to contacts who will help you establish yourselves." James stared at him in shock. "Sir, I don't understand." "Don't you?" The colonel's eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "The city will be surrounded soon. When that happens, rationality will be the first casualty. There will be those who insist on fighting street by street, building by building, and there will be consequences for anyone perceived as less than absolutely committed." The implication was clear. The colonel knew, or at least suspected, that his son-in-law's loyalties might be questioned. "What about you?" James asked, his throat tight. "I have my duties here. Someone must ensure the remaining civilian infrastructure continues to function as long as possible." The colonel opened his desk drawer and removed a thick envelope. "Everything you need is here. You leave tomorrow night." James accepted the envelope, his mind racing. "Elise won't want to leave without you. Then you must convince her." The colonel's voice softened. "Tell her it is my last request as her father. Tell her that Clara needs at least one grandfather to spoil her properly when this madness ends." The meeting left James in an impossible position. To accept the colonel's plan would mean abandoning his mission at its most critical juncture. To refuse would mean exposing Elise and Clara to dangers he had always promised himself he would shield them from. That night, after putting Clara to bed, James told Elise of her father's plan. Her reaction was exactly as he had anticipated. "Absolutely not," she said firmly. "I will not leave my father alone. I will not run while others cannot. Elise, please, think of Clara." "I am thinking of Clara." Her eyes flashed with determination. "What would I tell her when she's older? That we abandoned her grandfather? That we saved ourselves while others suffered? What kind of example is that?" James knew he could force the issue. He could reveal his true identity, explain the danger they would face when the truth came to light. But doing so would destroy her trust forever, and possibly endanger her further by making her complicit in his deception. Instead, he held her close. "We will stay," he said softly, "but promise me you will keep Clara safe above all else." "I promise," she whispered against his shoulder. "We will face whatever comes together, as a family." The following day, James transmitted what would be his final scheduled message to his handlers. Evacuation opportunity declined. Remaining in position. Request immediate contact upon arrival of Allied forces. Subject and family to be granted protected status per previous communications. He had no way of knowing if his request would be honored, if his message was even received. All he could do now was wait for the inevitable and prepare as best he could for the moment when all his deceptions would be laid bare. In February 1945, American forces reached the outskirts of Cologne. The sound of artillery was no longer distant, but immediate and terrifying. Most of the city's remaining military personnel had retreated eastward across the Rhine, but Colonel Hoffman remained at his post, coordinating what little civilian transport still functioned. "You should leave while you still can," James told him as they shared a meager meal in the colonel's increasingly empty home. Many of the furnishings had been burned for heat in the desperate cold. The colonel smiled sadly. "And go where, my son?" "No, my place is here, to the very end." 3 days later, American tanks entered the western districts of Cologne. That same morning, 2 men in plain clothes arrived at the Railway Administration building where Colonel Hoffman maintained his increasingly symbolic office. They arrested him on charges of defeatism and the misallocation of military resources. When James learned of the arrest, he made the most difficult decision of his life. Using an emergency channel he had been given for extreme circumstances, he transmitted a final, unauthorized message. Colonel Friedrich Hoffmann, arrested by German security forces. Request immediate intervention. Subject possesses critical intelligence on railway infrastructure throughout Western Sector. Arrest location: Cologne Security Headquarters, Geryon District. It was a desperate gamble, revealing his continued operational status while attempting to save his father-in-law. He had no way of knowing if the message would be received, much less acted upon. That night, as artillery shells fell on the eastern parts of the city, James held Elise and Clara in the relative safety of their building's cellar. Other families huddled nearby, all of them waiting for whatever morning would bring. "They will execute him," Elise whispered, her face pale but composed, "for being reasonable, for being human." "We don't know that," James replied, though he feared she was right. "I know my father. He will not beg. He will not denounce others to save himself." She looked down at Clara, sleeping somehow despite the distant sounds of conflict. He deserved better than this end. James could offer no comfort that wasn't based on lies, so he simply held her closer and whispered, "Try to rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough." The next day, American forces secured most of Cologne west of the Rhine. James, knowing the moment of truth had arrived, left Elise with Clara and their neighbor, while he made his way cautiously toward the American lines. He had no idea what he would find, whether his final message had been received, whether Colonel Hoffmann was still alive, whether his own status as an agent would be recognized after months without regular contact. He was stopped at a checkpoint 3 blocks from his apartment by American soldiers who regarded his civilian clothes with suspicion. Using his rusty English, a language he had deliberately avoided for nearly 2 years, he asked to be taken to their intelligence officer. "I have information regarding OSS operations in this sector," he said carefully, using terminology that would identify him to the right people while remaining meaningless to most. The soldiers exchanged glances, but eventually escorted him to a requisitioned building where a harried-looking lieutenant reviewed his identification papers with skepticism. "Wait here," the lieutenant ordered, disappearing into another room. 20 minutes later, a jeep arrived outside, and a man in a major's uniform entered the building. The moment James saw him, relief washed over him. It was William Carrington, his former handler, now wearing an army uniform instead of civilian clothes. "Miller," Carrington said loudly for the benefit of others present, then more quietly, "Donovan, you're alive." "Sir," James responded, falling back into English completely now. "My final transmission—" "Received," Carrington confirmed. "We've been looking for you since we entered the city, and for the colonel." He gestured toward the door. "Come with me." In the jeep, speeding through streets filled with American vehicles and shell-shocked civilians, Carrington explained the situation. "Based on your intelligence, a special operations team infiltrated the security headquarters last night. They found Colonel Hoffmann and 5 other detainees. 3 had already been executed." He glanced at James. "The colonel was scheduled for this morning, and now he's under our protection, being debriefed. His knowledge of the railway system is proving extremely valuable for reconstruction efforts." James closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed with relief. "And his status after debriefing?" Carrington shrugged. "That's above my pay grade, Donovan. But given your reports on his actions throughout the occupation and his cooperation now, I'd say he's one of the lucky ones." The jeep pulled up outside a formidable building now flying an American flag. Inside, after passing through several security checkpoints, James was led to a comfortable office where Colonel Hoffmann sat drinking coffee with an American colonel. The moment their eyes met, James knew that the colonel understood everything. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound weariness and perhaps a hint of respect. "Robert," he said, using the name he had known him by. "Or perhaps that is not your name at all." "James," he replied quietly. "James Donovan." The colonel nodded slowly. "American then, not Swiss. I suspected something was not quite as it seemed, but I did not allow myself to look too closely." He set down his coffee cup. "Elise and Clara? Safe. At our apartment with Frau Weber. Do they know? James shook his head. Not yet. The colonel was silent for a long moment. She will not forgive you easily. Perhaps not at all. I know. And yet, you saved my life. The colonel's eyes were penetrating. Why? It was the question James had asked himself repeatedly during the desperate hours after the colonel's arrest. Why risk his cover, his mission, possibly even future operations, for a man who was, technically, the enemy? Because you are a good man, James said simply. Because you are her father. Because Clara deserves to know her grandfather. He paused, then added, because some things matter more than sides in a conflict. The colonel nodded slowly. Go to her. Tell her I am safe, then tell her the truth, all of it. She deserves that much. The journey back to their apartment was the longest of James's life. Every step toward Elise felt like a step toward both salvation and damnation. When he finally reached their door and knocked, his key suddenly seeming like a presumption he had no right to make, he had no idea what words he would use. Elise opened the door, Clara in her arms. The relief on her face at the sight of him quickly gave way to concern. Robert, what's wrong? You look— Your father is safe, he said quickly. He's with the Americans. They rescued him from the security headquarters. Her legs seemed to give way beneath her. James caught her and guided her to a chair, taking Clara from her arms. How? She whispered. How is that possible? James looked down at his daughter, now nearly 4 months old, her eyes wide and curious. Then he looked at his wife, the woman he had been sent to deceive, but had ended up loving more than he had believed possible. There's something I need to tell you, he began. My name is not Robert Miller. The full truth took hours to explain. James held nothing back. Not the calculated nature of their initial meeting, not the intelligence he had gathered, not the reports he had filed on her father's activities. Throughout his confession, Elise remained silent, her face growing paler, but her eyes never leaving his. When he finally finished, the apartment had grown dark, illuminated only by the single candle they had been carefully rationing. Clara slept peacefully in her makeshift cradle, unaware of the emotional tempest swirling around her. Say something, James finally whispered. Please. Was any of it real? Elise's voice was barely audible. Any of it at all? James reached for her hand. When she didn't pull away, he took it as a hopeful sign. All of it. Not at first, but very soon after. I fell in love with you, Elise. That was never a lie. She looked down at their intertwined hands. I don't know who you are. I'm the man who loves you, who loves our daughter, who wants, more than anything, to build a real life with you, not based on deception but on truth. And if I cannot forgive this? The question cut him to the core, but he answered honestly. Then I will still ensure you and Clara are protected, your father too. Whatever happens between us, I will make sure you are safe. Elise was silent for a long time, her face unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Finally, she asked, what happens now? I don't know exactly, James admitted. I'll be debriefed, probably sent home eventually. But I've requested that you and Clara be allowed to come with me, and your father if he wishes, to America. Yes, to start over, together, if you'll have me. Elise looked over at their sleeping daughter. She deserves a father. She has one, James said softly. Whether you can forgive me or not, I will always be her father. Another long silence fell between them. Outside, the sounds of the occupied city continued, vehicles moving through the streets, occasional gunfire in the distance, the murmur of voices speaking a language that had been enemy but was now liberator. I need time, Elise finally said, to think, to process all of this. James nodded, relief and apprehension warring within him. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. It was a space between, a space where possibility still existed. I understand, he said, standing. I should report back. Let them know I've found you. They'll arrange for extra rations, medical care if you need it. As he moved toward the door, Elise's voice stopped him. James. His real name on her lips sent a shiver through him. Did you request my father's rescue? He turned back to face her. Yes. Why? Because he is a good man. Because he is your father. because I love you." Something flickered in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "We'll talk more then." It was a small opening, a tiny crack in a door he had feared permanently closed. James nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. As he stepped out into the ruined city, now under American control, James Donovan faced an uncertain future. The war was ending. His mission was complete. But the greatest challenge of his life was just beginning, rebuilding trust with the woman he had married under false pretenses, but had grown to love with his entire heart. And that rebuilds our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.